Um, all right. Um, well, it's Wednesday at noon. That means it's time for the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University. This year, the Iowa Learning Farms is celebrating 20 years, so be on the lookout for special events coming up. And we're really fortunate today to have a colleague and I'd say a friend. We've known each other for over a dozen years, probably since the Sustainable Corn Project. But Dr. Lindsay Pease is an assistant professor and extension specialist with the University of Minnesota. She's located in Crookston, Minnesota, so up in the northern part of Minnesota. Had the great fortune to go up there this last summer for a field day and our drainage research forum up there. And today she's going to talk about, does tile drainage pay if you only get 20 inches of precipitation? Thanks again, Lindsay, and the virtual floor is all yours.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Really exciting to be here today. And I'm excited because we've just kind of completed 4 years of a tiling project and really looking at results that we've had at up here. I thought today was a really good time to talk about what happens when you have tile drainage and you have less than 20 inches of precipitation. I know usually as the further south you go, you experience more precipitation, but sometimes giving some insight into what happens when you have less rainfall is also can be really interesting. So with that, okay, here we go. Yeah, so many of you are familiar with the Mississippi River Basin and that green area of the screen, but this map is showing just the different watersheds of North America. And the reason why I'm showing this map is because we are located up at the Northwest Research and Outreach Center in that purple, the Red River Basin of the North. So our water, instead of going south to the Gulf of Mexico, is actually going north into Lake Winnipeg. And being this far north, we have some unique challenges to farming, namely that it is cold. Our not so much this winter. This picture is not from this winter, but typically we experience a lot of snowfall and extremely cold temperatures in the winter. And this freezes the soil profile sometimes down as far as 3 feet deep. It really is a limiting factor when it comes to farming because not only do we experience extreme cold in the winter, then once the ground starts to warm up, we still have a frozen layer in the soil because, as I mentioned, it's frozen down to about 3 feet. So you have the top melting a little bit and it's melting from the bottom, but you still have a frozen layer that results in a lot of springtime flooding because all that snow melts all at once. And this picture is from Grand Forks, North Dakota. And this is showing, just that Red River filled up with water. Sometimes it gets so full that it even goes above that bridge that you see in the background. And this is a nearly annual occurrence. So we're always dealing with a lot of excessive amounts of water in our fields right before planting. And these are a couple other images just from around Crookston. You can see some of the flood control structures that we have. And we really have a lot of ways of managing surface water. Surface water management has been really abundant in the area for many years, as a way to kind of manage those floodwaters and get that moving off the fields and into the rivers. But we still have a lot of, even with that, a lot of sediment moving and a lot of, with that water, it's a lot of water moving at a high rate of velocity, and we get a lot of movement. And we still experience a lot of delays in spring planting due to the amount of water that's moving over the landscape. One thing that we are seeing a lot in the Red River Valley over the last several years is that Red River Basin farmers are installing tile drainage. This is kind of one of the booming locations for tile drainage. This map is showing the percent of harvested acres in 1992. This was back when the Census of Agriculture was done. And just to zoom in a little bit, you can see how there is some tiling happening in southern Minnesota, but really not much to speak of up in our neck of the woods in northwest Minnesota. Now, by 2012 and then by 2017, you can really start to see, those tiling start to move northward, and really, it's becoming really more common. Even since the last time this survey was done in 2017, we have been seeing even more tiling going in the Red River Basin as a way to manage that moisture. And one thing that kind of comes to mind is like, well, we don't get a lot of rainfall every year. I've put some stars over where Crookston is. So, are we really getting the benefit of drainage when we only get about 23 inches of rainfall in a given year? And what we're seeing is, and that's sort of the idea behind these drainage plots. When I came up to Crookston, we had some drainage research, but it had really been a long time before any drainage research had happened in Northwest Minnesota. So we have about 23 inches of rainfall on an annual basis on average, and our growing degree days, or our average annual temperature, is only about 40 degrees. So, our short growing season means that every single day that you can have in your growing season is important. It's a short season, it's so critical. And so one of the ideas was, does those extra couple of days that you can have from, possibly being able to work the field, does that really add a benefit to install the tile drainage? So with that, we decided to install some drainage system. And because of that 40-degree annual average temperature, I can say that Crookston now has the coolest drainage plots in the entire United States by annual average temperature. So we are doing a lot of measurements out here, not just looking at yields, but we are measuring surface runoff, tile discharge, nutrient concentrations. This is not just on a small plot basis, though. We have multiple large plots. We are farming these at a commercial scale because we really wanted these to be big so that they could be reflected in, what farmers are actually doing. And these are farmed commercially on station as part of the Research and Outreach Center system. We do have some portions of land that we farm commercially, and we sell the yield to help support operations that are happening, so far from the Twin Cities. And these plots are part of that commercial operation. So we can really have a good look and an accurate look at how a typical farm might be, both farming and managing these drainage plots. And of course, having these highly visible, easily accessible, good place for location, with the Iowa Learning Farms. Obviously, this is not something that's foreign to many of you, but, is a little bit new, especially in this region of Minnesota. So these plots, we finally got them installed in 2019. And one of the things that I love about this image is that it really shows the need in this particular field for tile drainage. You see this water ponding, the wheat came off, the wheat was harvested, our tile was delivered to the site, but it was actually too wet to even install the tile drainage right away. So we ended up waiting quite a bit for that ponded water to clear, and finally got this installed in about mid-October of 2019. Now, with those really wet soils, we can see we made a really big mess of all of this field. We had a lot of compaction from that construction equipment. We actually installed 2 different lift stations in this field. So we had not 1, but 2, deep lift stations installed with the excavator. We even, when we were pulling installing those tile lines. The drain plow was pulled by a tractor so that it wouldn't get stuck in the mud. So you can really just imagine the amount of compaction and mess that we made was really not installed under ideal conditions, but sometimes that's what you have to do to get the drainage installed. And finally, we were up and running by mid-November. And of course, I did want to mention, you can see the two lift stations here. The one in the foreground is for our surface, or it's for our tile water. And the one in the back, it collects our surface water from surface inlets and discharges that in a separate pool of water so we can keep those separate. And even though we had these up and running in November 18, pretty shortly after this, we turned off the lift stations to kind of keep that undrained condition more in place until the next growing season, but also because our lift stations might freeze. And so freezing is a real concern if you keep these lift stations running in cold conditions. Just another quick overview of the design and layout of these plots. We have this 60-acre field divided into 4 large 15-acre plots, as I mentioned before. We designed the drainage system for all 60 acres, but we only ran laterals for 2 of the 4 sections, so we could alternate a drained section and an undrained section. And that's what is, allowing us to do these comparisons. The tile installation is about 3 feet deep and 50 feet apart in plots 1 and 3. We do have a silty clay loam soil here, so it's one of our heavier textured soils, or finer textured soils. One thing that's kind of important to note, though, is that we are only farming this as one unit. We are not farming the 4 different sections differently. Partly that's so that all of the plots are treated the same. But one thing that's a disadvantage of this is that we don't really see that benefit of possibly being able to access these plots a little bit earlier in the spring. Because we have to wait for the whole field to be ready before we can plant. The past 4 years, we have been in a wheat soybean rotation. So in 2019, where before we installed the drainage, obviously that was wheat. Then we rotated into soybeans for the first year, wheat in the second year, and so on. One change we're expecting to do is in 2024, we are going to plant sugar beets out in this field for the first time, which is another major cash crop in our region. But for today, we're really only talking about the wheat and the soybeans. So what have we learned in the past 4 years as we have been doing this research? Well, first of all, since this is all about rainfall, we only averaged about 19 inches of rainfall by water year. So that's from the period between October to September throughout the whole 4-year period. So we kind of see some of that skyrocketing back and forth. Some years it's a little higher, some years it's certainly lower. But kind of on average, we're at that 19 inches of precip per year. Now, one reason why we started to look at the water year as opposed to a calendar year is, especially when we have the soil profile freeze for the winter months, we really start banking our soil moisture for the upcoming year all the way as soon as that previous crop comes off in October. So when we take these annual rainfall amounts and then start to look at them on a monthly basis, now you can see again how variable our different years were. We really captured a wide range of conditions between our 4 years. And one thing I really want you to pay some attention to is really this the yellow bar, the first bar. You can see how our very first year of operation in June and July, we just had so much rainfall just in time for the drainage plots to go in. And we had 7 inches of rainfall in July and nearly 5 inches of rainfall in June. So this is when the crop is really small, really vulnerable to high intensity rainfall events. And so you can see just how far above that dashed line, that 10-year average this was. So as we start to compare our wheat to our 2019 baseline, so we grew wheat in 2019, and then that's kind of the upper left-hand corner of, or upper right-hand corner of the screen, and the picture that kind of goes along with it. You can see on this yield map how this field, before we installed any drains, really came out fairly similarly. Once we started to look at 2019, you can see how where we had the drainage installed, kind of the left-hand corner of this yield map compared to kind of the center part, where you start to see those kind of red-orange blotches. That's actually where we had drainage installed. Now, 2019 was a pretty normal year. 2020, I mentioned, was really wet. 2021 was really very dry. So dry, in fact, that picture that you see where there's a water bottle next to a crack, we really saw pretty intensive cracking of the soil. Those shrink swell clays, they were splitting. So we were so dry in those years that, we actually saw the soil splitting apart. And of course, this last picture, then I changed that bottom graph to 2023, and you can see again how in 2023 there really isn't a big difference between our baseline and our between the different plots. Okay, so now we're going to talk about soybeans, and here I've highlighted our two different tile drainage sections for our soybean year. And you can see in 2020, that's a really wet year. You can actually see the red horizontal lines through those yield maps. Those are actually our drainage ditches. And you can see where we had water ponding and really gathering in those low spots. But you can also kind of see how our undrained areas, the ones that are not highlighted, we had lower yields than in our drained sections. And then by 2022, where we had rain earlier but not as late, then you can sort of start to see really those differences kind of going away. One thing I wanted to mention that was different in 2020 is that this is the area that we saw a lot of moisture gathering. We saw a lot of compaction. This is up in this top northwest corner of the field. That's where this image is from. And what this is showing is a lot of compacted soil right where we had most of our construction equipment coming in when we installed the tile drainage. And you can really see the effect of that compaction down up in this upper northwest corner. On the opposite side of the field, in the southeast corner in 2020, we started to see a lot of ponding. So we had low yields in each corner of the field, but for different reasons. One, because that's where we were driving all of our equipment. And on the other hand, we started to see low yields where we had some surface ponding. So it sounds like I've taken you through the different yield maps, just to see how these numbers kind of shook out on an average basis. What we saw, again, we have 2019 as our baseline, nothing was drained. We saw right away in 2020 a benefit of drainage. We had so much rainfall in June and July of that year when the soybeans were really small that we immediately saw a boost to our soybean yields. Now in 2021, we actually saw the opposite. And I'd sort of pointed this out in those yield maps before. We had kind of lower yields in those drained areas. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But what we do see in 2022 and 2023, so 2022 also had quite a bit of rain happening early. 2023 was another more dry year. But we really saw those differences between the two, the drained and the undrained fields, sort of even out. There was no significant difference between the yields for 2022 or 2023. Now, when we talk about the difference between 2020 and 2023, what I think really stands out is about soil moisture. So at the top, you can see here we have the percent soil moisture in the top 6 inches of the profile. And what I think is really cool is where I've highlighted this in blue, in the blue arrow, is that you can actually see where the lift stations were turned on. We waited until that floodwater cleared before we turned our lift stations on and started pumping out the drainage system. So think of this like a controlled drainage. We're controlling the outlet, we're managing that outlet, and we're waiting until there's capacity downstream before we're draining our field. And you can actually see the moisture between the drained and the undrained portions separate after we've turned on the lift stations for the first time. And you can see the benefit of the drainage, especially once you get into that, again, as I mentioned, the June and July, that we had really heavy rainfall. And those differences in soil moisture kept throughout the entire rest of the growing season, including when the last time we collected data, which was in late October, where we still saw lower soil moisture in our drained plots than our undrained plots. Now, once we go to 2021, we start to see then the kind of opposite effect happen. We see all of the soil moisture just dropping. We had basically no moisture in those soils. We had very little rainfall and very little in either the drained or the undrained plots. So what we started to see here is that, regardless of whether we had drainage or not, we did not have enough moisture to produce the crop. And so I think what this really shows is that, even though I said there were lower yields in 2021 for our wheat and our drained plots, that really, I don't think is because of this soil moisture. I think it has to do with some of that compaction and some of that construction impact that we saw back when we installed this in 2019. Because some of that compaction, we saw that immediate benefit of drainage in 2020, but then once we saw that dry year happen, really it was compacted. It wasn't letting moisture absorb as well, and that would really have hurt our wheat yields in 2021. And then, of course, by 2022 and 2023, the good news is we started to see that sort of taper off. And again, that even though we were still kind of dry throughout the growing season, we didn't see as much of an impact of the drainage installation. So now when we're talking about nitrogen, because this is another piece that we were looking at, is how the subsurface drainage is changing our nitrogen rate. And we do see that drainage, this is not going to come as a surprise, but it moves excess nitrogen downward in the soil profile. So this graph is just going to show the difference between our untiled sections and our tiled sections and the amount of soil nitrate that we saw at each spring, right before we went out and started farming the crop, and separated by depth. So what we saw in spring of 2020, as we mentioned, we had no drainage up to this point. We had a wet fall. This was right after the drainage installation happened. Also, we were moving into soybeans, so there was no fall nitrogen applied. And what we see is that there actually was a lot of nitrogen left in the soil profile after the previous year's wheat crop. In the top 12 inches to the 24 inches, you had almost between almost up to 100 to maybe 80 pounds of nitrogen just left in the top 24 inches of the soil profile. In spring of 2021, we were moving into growing spring wheat. And again, there was fertilizer applied between the time when these samples were taken and when we started to crop. when we started to plant the crop, the nitrogen was applied right before planting. I did put the dashed line up there that's going across the screen at about 155 pounds of nitrogen. That's our yield, that's our soil goal for the 0 to 24 inches. So we really had quite a lot of nitrogen that needed to go on after our soybean crop. But again, that's not a surprise. And even given that we had slightly different yields between our tiled and our untiled sections, when we start to think about averages and soil moisture and how much nitrogen, even though we had, those drains were flowing a lot, we had a good crop growing, and we did not actually see any differences in that soil profile nitrogen, which I think is pretty good news in terms of, nitrate losses from tile drainage. We did not see the drainage losing an excessive amount of nitrate through the tile drainage even though we had a little bit more rain than usual. And then finally, spring 2021, we fertilized for that crop of about, we were hoping to get 70 bushels per acre, but we only got about 50. So for spring of 2022, we had the wet spring after the drought. And again, we were moving into soybeans, but you can see where a lot of that nitrogen was still there. And it had moved downward, but it had moved downward both in our untiled sections and our tiled sections. So you can again see kind of that movement of nitrogen down in the soil profile. Skip that one. And we are just, as an added kind of bonus, we are looking at the nitrogen concentrations out on these farms. You can see the 2 lift stations. These are to look at, what we're losing through the tile drains. And just for the interest of time, I didn't include the nitrate losses in this presentation, but I can share that even though we had really variable amounts of nitrogen, and a lot of rainfall the first year, our nitrate losses were relatively low. They were all between, really a maximum of about 15 parts per million. So we really didn't see a lot of nitrogen at these low precipitation levels. We did not see a lot of nitrogen, again, moving out of the soil profile. A lot of it was still accumulating. So does tile drainage pay? I think yes. I think we do see the importance of the drainage, especially in the soybean yields for 2020. Another thing we saw in 2022 is those soybeans, the grain was a little bit drier in our drain plots than our undrained plots. So even though the yields weren't any different, there's kind of some indication that we maybe could have harvested a little bit sooner in our drained plots in 2022. But I will also say that the timing of the rainfall is everything, because even though we had, a lot of rainfall in 2022, that didn't really lend itself to increased yields or showing the benefit of drainage, just because a lot of that rainfall happened before the growing season started. And I do think we saw the effect of the compaction for our reduced yields of 2021. We did not see any soil moisture really in either plot. So that was regardless of drainage, hardly any soil moisture that we saw. And, and I think one thing that it's a common misconception about drainage, especially up here where drainage is still pretty new, is that, the concern that tile drainage will over dry the soil. And I will say, I don't personally think we saw a lot of evidence of that in 2021. I think we just saw that there was no soil moisture at all. But that's where, the conservation practice of controlled drainage can really plug in and say during those drought years, holding back the soil moisture as much as possible. Now with lift stations in the Red River Basin, basically farmers have the ability to do controlled drainage because these outlets operate on a circuit breaker. You can literally turn the drainage on and off. And so, because we were doing research, I didn't turn the lift stations off between that 2020 to 2021 winter. But if I were trying to do controlled drainage, and if I were kind of managing the way that I think would be kind of ideal for a controlled drainage situation, I'm not even sure we would have needed to turn the lift stations on in 2021. And again, I will say, when you have this less than 20 inches of rainfall, you can see drainage moving nitrogen downward in the soil profile, but it really isn't moving all the way out. That doesn't seem to be enough rain to really flush the system out, which I think is good news for a drought year. Now, of course, if you're in a place where you get more rainfall than that, that more rainfall can move it downward a lot more. But when you're in that drought situation, I think you can count on a lot of that N still being in the soil profile. One thing that I'm pretty excited to see is you could see in 2022, we had a lot of residual nitrogen in the soil profile. Now, one crop that we have in our rotations that can really harvest a lot of that deep nitrogen are sugar beets. Sugar beets get soil tested all the way down to 48 inches, so 4 feet down. They can access nitrogen down to 4 feet. So I'm really curious to see, we're going to plant some sugar beets in 2024. And I'm hoping to see a lot of really good results from that as well. So with that, obviously a lot of data collection goes in here. I want to thank everybody for their time, and I am able to take some questions if there are any.
All right, thanks so much, Lindsay. Are there last couple slides on the end? You can grab a drink of water, and I can go through those last couple slides and get you ready, because there are some questions that have come in.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you watch this webinar live and need a CCA CEU, please send your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number to Elena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today. Again, ALENAW at iastate.edu, your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Let's go to the next slide, which should be, if you are willing to do a voluntary demographic survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. If you watch this webinar live and can fill that out, that would be fabulous. Only one survey response is needed for all 2024 webinars. You can go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey or scan the QR code. Again, iowalearningfarms.org/survey. Or the QR code. Thank you very much. And Ann put in there to email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu for the CCA CEUs. Okay, and the last one to plug the webinar for next week. Winter cover crop effects on the optimum N rate of corn across a multi-state field experiment. So Dr. Hannah Poffenbarger from University of Kentucky. Dr. Poffenbarger got her PhD, I think, under Mike Castellano here at Iowa State University. So we're going to be reaching out to somebody in Kentucky, which is great. So we're going from Crookston, Minnesota to Kentucky. All right, with that, Lindsay, we do have some questions. There are a couple in here. Do you have plans on doing any controlled drainage in this system in the future?
Yeah, I am really excited about the idea of doing some controlled drainage work on these plots. I mean, really for the reasons that I talked about as we were summarizing, because especially in the Red River Valley, we're perfectly suited to do some controlled drainage. Like I said, you can turn those drainage stations on with a flip of a switch. And I really think that's going to be a good way of making sure we're maximizing our soil moisture for the crop production. So I guess, yeah, the short answer is yes. But for the first 4 years, we really wanted to get a good baseline of what the drainage was doing, drained versus undrained. So that's why we haven't done it quite yet.
Yeah. Not only do you have the pumps so that, it's like in the system that you could do it, but you're also flat as a pancake up there, right? So,
Yes.
so it's that. I was just talking to somebody this morning about controlled drainage, and I'm like, in Iowa, I don't know if we're that flat, but up where you are, I think we drove from I-35 to Crookston. It felt like it was just about as dead flat as you can get. Sorry.
That's definitely true. Yeah, we are so flat, and you can kind of see that in some of the pictures I showed. You can see that, but it really doesn't hit you until you're really on the highway and you can just see forever.
Forever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Do you have numbers? Are you collecting numbers for phosphorus in that drainage water as well?
We are collecting the phosphorus information as well. And one thing that we're sort of on the lookout for, and we haven't done a full analysis of the phosphorus yet, but we are kind of looking to see if maybe we're seeing a little bit of higher phosphorus rates those first few years after the installation. That's
Mm.
something that, I've heard anecdotally that maybe there's some more just because of, again, the construction, if there is higher phosphorus in those first couple of years. But we haven't really done the full analysis of that yet. But yeah, we are being in the Red River Basin. Our water going to Lake Winnipeg is a freshwater system. So looking at the differences between surface water and tile water and how those concentrations are looking is really important and is one of the big goals of the project. Yeah.
Okay, great. Do you have any open inlets allowing surface water to mix with that subsurface water?
Yeah, I forgot to mention this when we were talking about the design, but we actually have two separate lift stations at this site. One of them is collecting surface water from surface inlet. And traditionally, under a normal design, a regular design, those would all go into one lift station. But actually, we decided to separate those and put two separate lift stations so we have a completely separate stream of surface water that's being collected in our surface inlets compared to our drainage system. So we don't have any surface water going into the tile
Great.
lift station.
Okay. Would you expect any differences in a silt loam or a sandy silt or sandy loam soil?
Yeah, I do think, because these were silty clay loam soils, these are some of our more finer textured, heavier soils. I think that, yeah, we are seeing, that nitrogen is kind of staying in place. It's holding the water a little bit more tightly to the soil. So yeah, we probably would see different results in a sandier soil. We do have a kind of a partner site that we've been monitoring that is on more of a sandier soil, also in the same county. But
Okay.
again, kind of don't have that comparison all the way done yet.
Okay. Have you characterized the rainfall patterns beyond the annual total? So, kind of thinking about spring versus growing season, so forth.
Yeah, I haven't really looked at it too far beyond just observationally, but I think that'd be a really good idea, and it's going to be super important. We have a short growing season here, and anything that happens really between May and August, is going to be super important to the crop. And we've been drier than wetter the last several years for sure.
Okay. There was kind of maybe to expand a little bit or clarify this. Are there water quality differences between what we might see in the open inlet versus if it's a pure subsurface drainage system?
Yeah, we definitely see higher phosphorus in our surface water than in our tile drainage water. That's been pretty clear even with the initial books we've had about phosphorus. Really, I think you get a big benefit of that water being absorbed into the soil a little bit more and having some opportunity to bind with the soil with tile drainage that you don't get with surface runoff, which is just going to carry a lot of sediment along with it.
There's a question here that they kind of thinking about tiled versus undrained fields that they've heard reports that the tile installed upstream of a non-tiled field may actually help that downstream field with the excess moisture issues. And have you heard about that, or has that been brought up in thinking about your plots? Any orientation or so forth.
Yeah, so for our plots are actually in kind of the most upstream part of the fields that kind of surround them. So we don't have a lot of water coming onto our plots, but we would kind of possibly influence those downstream. And we haven't had, I haven't had any complaints from the guys on the farm, saying, oh, you're flooding out, the field just to the north, which is where the direction that this excess water is flowing. So we haven't seen really anything either way, but also haven't been specifically looking for it.
Okay. this is kind of a good one. I'm not sure any of us know an answer on this one, Lindsay, but I don't know. I'm not trying to bias it in any way, um, but maybe we could speculate a little bit. But you described the tile drainage as paying off, and I think on your soils. But now thinking about, does it matter where the tiles paled off? For example, um, certainly in Iowa, we see it. Many producers are moving upslope from the traditionally poorly or somewhat poorly drained soils. And does it still pay in those kind of more moderately well-drained soils?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And I don't know that I have a good answer for that. I do know that, when you have a tile system, and especially if you have a controlled drainage system with it, that does give you the opportunity to kind of be a little bit more flexible with what you're doing. Especially on farm, I'm really curious. There's a farmer that we work with, and he's got a drainage system and an irrigation system. So he has the works as far as draining. Um, as far as draining goes. And I think there definitely are going to be scenarios and situations where in the less poorly and moderately well drained soils, it still does have a benefit.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I think that's an area, we've traditionally not, I think, for most of our, research work, we've done drainage studies on more poorly drained soils, because we've not traditionally thought those others needed drainage, so we don't have real good data on it. In fact, even some of the overall yield data is somewhat lacking on drained versus undrained. Somebody did bring up on your slide on the yields. I think it was 2020 you saw yield benefit with the drainage, but then 21 you saw yield hit. So they so the yields actually decreased or about the same if we look at overall those years. Um, I guess what one thing is, you think that's a factor of it being many dry years in a row?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is that, when we had that rainfall, the tile drainage was really critical to making sure that we got any yield at all. The difference between a 34 bushel soybean crop and a 40 bushel soybean crop was pretty significant, I think, in that first year. And of course, a 40 bushel soybean crop isn't unusual for this far north. So it really allowed us to be a little bit more consistent from year to year, I think is what we saw. Um, and so yeah, even though we saw that yield decrease in 2021, I also think that, that was just kind of a 1 year thing and then it evened out. Whereas, we're hopefully going to get a lot more wet years in the future. So we're going to keep seeing that. And sorry if that wasn't quite
No,
as clear as I'd hoped.
well, no, but it's interesting too, because yeah, one was wheat yield and one was soybean yield. And so 4 bushels for soybean may mean a lot more than 6 bushels for wheat from the standpoint of the financial side, or yeah, thinking of it that way. I hadn't thought of it. As you were talking, I got to thinking about it that way as well. So um all right. I think we got most of the questions addressed. I think this is, there was somebody that asked whether you considered ripping the deep ripping after the tiling to help with any compaction issues.
Yeah, so we did not do any deep ripping immediately after. And actually, that was partly because, we were kind of going out and collecting soil samples and kind of trying to get that really good baseline. They did do quite a lot of tiling or quite a bit of tilling right over the tile lines to kind of try to even that out. But we didn't see the first kind of tillage event until I think it was maybe after the soybeans came off that first year. So in between that, soybeans and the wheat, in that kind of drier period was when we first had some kind of 6-inch deep tillage happening out
Okay.
there.
Okay. Um, all right. Again, if you need a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with the name you entered to watch the webinar, your CCA number, uh, yeah, CCA number, name you entered to watch the webinar by 5 o'clock today. And with that, Lindsay, I'll give you the last word. Thank you again for participating in our webinar series. It's really greatly appreciated and great to get the perspective from the coldest drainage plots in the U.S.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks for having me.
Okay, we're going to stop the recording.